Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back in time, way back to when the Valley of Mexico wasn't just a dry basin with a sprawling capital city, but a glimmering patchwork of lakes, islands, and distant volcanoes. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of Lake Texcoco, your toes in the wet mud, and your eyes trying to take in a horizon shimmering with water reeds and scattered islands. The air smells damp, earthy, a little fishy, and somewhere nearby a heron calls out. That's where you are tonight, a watery landscape waiting for someone bold enough to turn it into the beating heart of an empire. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you want to play along, drop a comment with your location and the local time. I always find it oddly comforting to see where in the world you all are, especially when I'm telling a story about a people who measured their whole lives by the rise and fall of the sun over these same lakes. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're trudging with the first waves of Aztec migrants centuries ago arriving into this valley that if you squint looks almost too crowded already. Because the truth is, the Aztecs, or Mexico as they called themselves, weren't the first to discover this watery world. Other city-states had already staked out lands, built temples, and made alliances. You're late to the party, basically. But here's the twist. You're also scrappy, stubborn, and convinced that the gods have promised you greatness, though right now, greatness looks more like soggy sandals and empty stomachs. The lake is both promise and punishment. It's fertile, yes, but it's shallow and brackish, and there's not a whole lot of dry land to go around. Settling here is like trying to set up camp on a waterbed. It's squishy, unstable, and someone else already owns the comfortable spots. Still, you're determined. Historians still argue whether it was desperation, vision, or divine signs that pushed the Mexica to claim a small patch of swampy ground on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Either way, this unpromising spot would become Tenochtitlan, a city so dazzling that conquistadors later couldn't stop bragging about it even as they were tearing it down. But back to you standing in the muck. You don't have much in the way of tools, no steel, no draft animals, not even a handy Home Depot for supplies. What you do have is ingenuity. The shallow lake glitters with reeds, sedges, and mud. These raw, humble ingredients will eventually give you floating gardens or chinampas so stable and productive that they rarely sank no matter how much the water shifted. Think of it as ancient hydroponics, but with way more mosquitoes. For now, you're hungry. You scrape together whatever food you can, a handful of maize if you're lucky, some lake fish, maybe an axolotl or two. Yes, the same cute salamander people keep as pets today. You hear the croak of frogs, the buzz of dragonflies, and the splash of paddles from neighboring canoe traffic. It's busy here, noisy, alive, in a way that makes your heart beat a little faster. You've just arrived, but already you sense this lake will shape your destiny. The Mexica's early years in the valley weren't glamorous. They were mercenaries for hire, laboring for stronger city-states like Culhuacan. And yes, there's that infamous story about them offering their daughters in marriage to secure alliances and then turning around and sacrificing those same women to their gods. Quirky, disturbing, both. Either way, it set the tone for how other neighbors viewed these scrappy lake newcomers, dangerous, unpredictable, but not to be underestimated. As you paddle through reeds in a wobbly canoe, you can't help but imagine what it would take to claim real power here. The lake is fertile, sure, but without land to farm, how do you feed a growing population? That question sticks in your mind, nagging like the way wet clothes cling to your skin. The people around you argue about signs, omens, where to settle. Some swear that they'll know their place when they see an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a snake. Until then, you wait, watching the sun rise over the water, wondering if destiny really has time for you. Here's a fun tidbit to lull you deeper. Aztec priests weren't just looking at birds and snakes for signs. They also believed in reading the stars, the patterns in fire, and even how the wind carried certain smells across the lake. Imagine a holy man leaning over, sniffing the air like, yep, smells like empire today. Weird, sure, but also poetic. As night falls over the valley, the lake turns into a mirror reflecting torches from distant settlements. You lie on your back in a canoe, staring at the Milky Way stretched across the sky. The water laps gently against the wood, rocking you a reminder that everything here is precarious, your boat, your future, your very survival. You probably won't survive this if we're honest. The mosquitoes alone could take you out. But somehow, against the odds, this soggy beginning will sprout into something extraordinary. Tomorrow you'll get up, gather reeds and start experimenting with mud and mats, the first step toward turning water into farmland. But for tonight, the lake cradles you in its restless arms, whispering promises of a city that doesn't yet exist. You wake to the damp chill of lake air, the mist curling low over the surface, blurring the horizon. Canoes creak as they bump against one another, and reeds sway like restless sleepers. Your belly growls, reminding you that destiny is wonderful, and all but breakfast would be better. Still, the Mexica aren't much for giving up, and today you're learning something new: how to coax land from water, how to make the unsteady lake solid enough to plant. You start small. First, bundles of reeds cut long, tied tight, and woven together like mats get stacked on the water. Imagine a giant, slightly wobbly raft, but one that smells of grass and mud. Then comes the scoop, scoop, scoop of lake-bottom sludge, heavy and sticky. Mud gets piled on the reeds, pressed down, until it oozes between your toes. It's messy, sure, but you're not here for clean hands. You're here to make something float that can grow food. Historians still argue whether these first experiments were happy accidents. Maybe somebody just dumped mud onto a reed mat to anchor a canoe, or deliberate engineering guided by centuries of local trial and error. After all, earlier peoples in the valley had tinkered with similar methods. But the Mexica, they refined it, expanded it, and made it their own. The difference between a patchy garden and a floating farm empire is persistence. As the reed mud rafts take shape, you begin staking them down. Poles, sharpened logs of willow and ahuejote trees get driven into the lake bed, pinning the mats in place so they don't just drift away like lazy lily pads. The poles aren't just anchors, they'll sprout roots and branches, living guardians at the corners of each plot. A neat little trick of engineering and ecology rolled into one. You didn't just build land, you planted the very posts that keep it alive. By midday, the first garden is sturdy enough to stand on. You test it, nervously bouncing a little like you're on a water mattress. It wobbles, but it doesn't sink. Not today, not tomorrow either. Rarely at all, in fact. These chinampas are tougher than they look, and though they'll need constant care, they'll hold. If you were expecting something glamorous, you'll be disappointed. But if you wanted the slow magic of making dirt float, you've nailed it. The neighbors notice. Canoes drift closer, people leaning in, curious, skeptical. Some scoff that will never last. Others nod, calculating. Food is life after all, and you've just found a way to grow it where no one else bothered. You almost wish you'd patented it, though. Explaining intellectual property law in 14th century Mesoamerica would be complicated. Now for a quirky detail. Chinampa farmers didn't just pile mud once and call it a day. They dredged canals, constantly scooping nutrient-rich muck from the water and spreading it across the plots. Think of it as the world's earliest subscription-based fertilizer service. You pay in sweat and get bumper crops in return. Your stomach finally gets relief when someone roasts up tamales with fresh maize grown from a test patch. It's a humble meal, but the smoky aroma makes the entire floating platform feel like home. You chew slowly, listening to the gossip of your fellow settlers. They laugh about canoes tipping, argue about whether ducks should be herded or left wild, and tell children scary stories about the lake spirits who drag the careless under. Historians still debate how much of this Chinampa innovation came from desperation versus vision. Were the Mexica simply backed into a corner, forced to settle the swamp no one else wanted, or did they see from the start the potential for a vast network of floating gardens? Either way, the truth is, mud plus reeds plus stubborn people equals survival. At dusk, you paddle through narrow canals lined with fresh chinampas. The air hums with insects and frogs croak in the reeds. Somewhere, a flute plays high and haunting. You lean back exhausted but oddly proud. You're living on water and you're making it work. And tomorrow there'll be more mud to scoop more reeds, to cut more rafts, to lash together. Slowly, steadily, the lake is being transformed, not conquered exactly, but persuaded into a checkerboard of life. And as you drift off to sleep, you wonder if this is only the beginning. What will it look like when the entire valley blooms with floating farms? The morning begins with a low, wet fog curling across the water, so thick you can't tell where the lake ends and the sky begins. You paddle carefully, half listening for the creak of poles and the splash of water against the reed walls of chinampas. This is the world you've helped shape an endless patchwork of floating gardens. But today the real trick isn't just making gardens float, it's making sure they don't float away. See, mud and reeds are lovely, but they don't exactly stay put in a stiff breeze. That's where the anchors come in. You join the others hauling long poles, straight, heavy stripped branches from ahuejote trees. The bark smells sharp and resinous as you set them upright, one at each corner of a chinampa. With rhythmic grunts, the poles get driven deep into the lake bed, thudding into place until they stand like sentinels. Soon enough, they'll sprout roots, grow tall, and lace the garden edges with living wood. Anchors that plant themselves pretty clever admit it. Historians still argue whether the anchoring technique was borrowed from earlier peoples around the lake or whether the Mexica perfected it. Either way, you're watching engineering blend seamlessly with ecology. The result isn't just a floating farm, it's a system that stabilizes itself, improves water quality, and doubles as habitat for birds and fish. You wanted dirt to stand on. Instead, you've made a miniature ecosystem. And here's the quirky part. Some farmers believed their chinampas were alive, almost like pets. They'd talk to them, coax them, even sing as they pressed fresh mud into the soil. Whether the chinampas listened or not is debatable, but hey, your crops don't complain about your singing voice. As you walk the length of a newly secured plot, your sandals leave faint prints in the soft soil. Water laps gently at the edges. A canoe glides by, stacked with poles, while children balance on the sides, laughing as they drop stones into the water. It looks peaceful, but make no mistake, this is serious survival work. Midday sun breaks through the fog, glinting off the canals, and you can see the growing order, straight rows of chinampas squared and framed like a watery chessboard. Each one is lashed tight to its poles, anchored in place, forming a web of stability. Canoes slip through like blood in veins, carrying reeds, food, and gossip from one family to the next. The system feels less like a collection of rafts now and more like a living city foundation. You kneel to press more mud into the soil, sweat running down your back. A neighbor cracks a joke about you being part farmer, part beaver. You laugh, though your arms ache. Still, it's worth it. For every load of lake muck spread across the chinampa, the soil grows richer, darker, more alive. Soon you'll plant maize, beans, chilies, and squash, and this patch of anchored dirt will feed families. But not everything is smooth sailing. Strong storms still threaten, and sometimes whole sections collapse or drift when poles snap loose. You hear the muttered curses of a farmer whose chinampa slid a few feet overnight, nudging awkwardly against his neighbors. Boundaries blur, tempers flare. You almost wish there were a medieval version of insurance claims. My floating garden trespassed into yours during last night's storm. Who's responsible for the damages? As night falls, the anchored chinampas stand dark against the shimmer of torchlight. You rest in your canoe, rocking gently, staring up at the stars. The lake is calmer now, but the anchors are what let you relax. Without them, everything would scatter, drifting endlessly, lost to wind and water. With them, you've made not just a farm, but a foothold. And as you drift towards sleep, lulled by the sound of frogs and distant drums, you can't help wondering what happens when all these anchored gardens connect, stretching further tighter until they form not just farmland, but a whole network, a watery grid, pulsing with life. The fog lifts early today, and from your canoe you can finally see the bigger picture. The Chinampas aren't just random floating plots anymore. They're organized, connected, carved into neat rectangles with ribbons of water glistening between them. The canals stretch out like veins or arteries pulsing with life. You trail your hand in the cool water and feel the soft current tug at your fingers. This is no longer just a survival hack. This is infrastructure. Canoes slip past you, their wooden hulls groaning softly under loads of reeds, baskets of maize, and the occasional pile of gossiping passengers. Children paddle recklessly, splashing each other until their mothers scold them from the garden edges. The canals are narrow in places, just wide enough for a canoe to glide through. In others, they open into wider lanes where two boats can pass, though not without a little jostling and muttered complaints about traffic. Yep, ancient lake traffic jams. Historians still argue whether the canal network grew deliberately like some grand city planner's design or organically shaped by the daily movements of farmers. But what's clear is that soon these waterways become the backbone of a city. Canoes carry everything, not just crops, but people, tools, even building stones. Without them, the Aztec heartland would have been stranded in the swamp. Here's a quirky detail for you. Some Chinampa families trained ducks and geese to act as early warning canal guards. Their honking and flapping would alert farmers if someone trespassed at night. Imagine your backyard security system quacking you awake at 3 in the morning. Not high-tech, but effective. You pause at the edge of a Chinampa, where a family is dredging canal mud. With long-handled scoops, they drag up thick, black muck, spreading it over the soil to keep it fertile. Every scrape deepens the canal, sharpening its edges. What started as muddy gaps between rafts has turned into true waterways, sturdy enough to last. The water smells faintly sweet, full of decomposing reeds and fish. Dragonflies hover above the surface, their wings catching sunlight like shards of glass. Midday comes and the canals bustle with movement. Canoes bump lightly against one another. Farmers bartering produce, children carrying clay jars of water balanced carefully on their knees. A vendor in a passing boat offers roasted chilies, wrapped in leaves, the spicy smoke trailing behind him. The whole scene is noisy, messy, and alive, a floating market in miniature. And yet beneath the liveliness you notice a sense of precision. The Chinampas are laid out in almost perfect rows, their straight lines reflecting into the canals. It's a geometry of survival, a design that makes farming efficient, transport easy, and community inevitable. At sunset you paddle through one of the main canals, the water glowing orange and gold. Reflections ripple with each stroke of your paddle. Ahead you hear the faint thump of drums and smell copal incense wafting across the lake. Festivals and ceremonies take place on the Chinampas too, with shrines at the corners, flowers offered to the gods and families, gathering to celebrate the cycles of planting and harvest. By the time darkness falls, the canals gleam with torchlight. You rest against the side of your canoe, listening to voices echo across the water, carried clear and sharp in the cool night air. For a moment you think of blood flowing through veins, each canal carrying life, each Chinampa like a vital organ. The city is still young, but you can feel it now. This watery grid is becoming something far bigger than its pieces. And as you drift towards sleep, you wonder if canals are the arteries of this world. What happens when the heart, the crops themselves, begin to beat stronger? Morning mist hovers low over the Chinampas, and the first thing that hits your nose is the scent of soil, damp, rich, freshly turned. Farmers are already at work, their hands plunging into the dark muck as they plant maize, beans, and squash, the three sisters of Mesoamerican farming. You kneel beside them, pressing kernels into furrows, and feel the weight of tradition in your fingertips. This isn't just food, it's a lifeline, a pact between humans, plants, and gods. The maize stalks will grow tall and straight like green spears pointing skyward. Around their bases, beans will twist upward, climbing like agile acrobats, clinging to the sturdy corn for support. Squash will sprawl across the soil, its broad leaves shading the ground, keeping the moisture in and the weeds out. Together they form a trio of cooperation, nutritionally balanced and agriculturally clever. You can almost hear them whisper to each other, "Don't worry, I've got your back." Historians still argue whether the genius of the three sisters was discovered in one flash of inspiration or slowly across centuries of tinkering. Either way, the Aztecs took the system and made it thrive here, anchored in their floating gardens. Without it, their empire would have been more dream than reality. You pause to chew on a roasted ear of corn, hot and smoky, the kernels bursting with sweetness. Across the canal, a neighbor ladles out bean stew, thick and savory, the steam curling into the air. Squash blossoms, golden and delicate, get fried into fritters. Dinner here is never boring, even if it's repetitive. And let's be honest, you'll eat so much maize you'll start dreaming in tortillas. But chinampas aren't only about the big three crops. Chili peppers blaze red among the leaves, tomatoes ripen on the vine, and amaranth waves its feathery stalks. There are herbs for flavor gourds, for containers, and medicinal plants tucked into corners. It's a farmer's market on water, and everything is fresh, organic, and locally sourced centuries before Instagram made those words trendy. A quirky tidbit drifts your way. Some Aztec farmers believed that singing to maize as it sprouted made it grow stronger. So you hum a tune while kneeling in the mud, half serious, half amused. Does it work? Who knows, but at least it keeps the mosquitoes entertained. By midday, the chinampas glow with green life, and the canals echo with laughter. Children chase each other along the narrow paths, careful not to tumble into the water. Fishermen pull up nets, wriggling with whitefish which they'll roast or barter at market. Ducks bob in the canals, flapping noisily when canoes drift too close. Everywhere you look, life is layered, crops above, roots below, water at the edges, fish darting just beneath the surface. As the sun dips low, you sit on the chinampa edge, feet dangling into the cool water. The fields sway gently in the breeze, and for a moment you feel the pulse of it, all the rhythm of planting, growing, harvesting, repeating. It's steady, reliable, a heartbeat of green. And yet you can't help but wonder if these gardens can feed a family, what happens when they're asked to feed an empire. The day breaks with a riot of color reds, yellows, purples, bursting against the green backdrop of maize fields. You rub your eyes, thinking at first it's just the sunrise catching the crops, but no, it's flowers. Rows and rows of blossoms spilling over the edges of chinampas, nodding in the soft breeze. Today you're not just tending food, you're tending beauty. Aztec farmers don't stop with corn and beans. They plant marigolds, dahlias, lilies, and countless other blooms, not only because they're pretty, but because they matter. Flowers are food for the gods, after all, and the gods have big appetites. Temples across Tenochtitlan require daily offerings, and chinampa farmers supply them in baskets fragrant with petals. You pick a bright marigold, its scent, sharp and earthy, and tuck it behind your ear. Instant fashion, upgrade, no judgment. Historians still argue whether the explosion of flower cultivation was mostly religious or also political, a way for elites to show off, parading through ceremonies with armfuls of blossoms like runway models of devotion. Either way, flowers became more than decoration. They were currency, sacrifice, and symbols of life's fleeting beauty. You spend the morning gathering blooms, your fingers sticky with pollen. Across the canal, women weave garlands, their laughter carrying over the water. Children pluck petals to float them like tiny boats, racing them down the current. There's joy here, a lightness that balances the seriousness of farming. And here's a quirky tidbit. Aztec warriors sometimes wore flower crowns into battle. Imagine charging into a fight smelling like roses and looking fabulous while swinging a macuahuitl club. Ferocious, yet stylish, a combination that modern gyms haven't quite nailed. By midday, you're paddling toward the city, your canoe piled with blossoms. The canals are alive with traffic boats stacked with maize, beans, fish, and now waves of flowers spilling over the sides like liquid color. The air smells sweet, layered with the musk of damp earth and roasted chilies drifting from cookfires. At the city's edge, temple courtyards overflow with offerings. Priests scatter petals across altars, their hands stained yellow and red. Processions march through the streets, drums pounding flutes, singing and dancers whirling, with garlands trailing from their arms. You stand in awe, half blinded by the sunlight glinting off obsidian blades, half dazed by the perfume of 1,000 blossoms crushed underfoot. The sun sinks, painting the lake in pinks and golds. You rest on a chinampa edge, watching the petals drift across the water. They swirl in eddies, scatter and sink, returning to the lake that nourished them. And as you drift towards sleep, you think food may feed the body, but flowers feed the spirit. And if both can bloom together on floating gardens, what else might grow here? Rivalries, alliances, entire communities shaped by water and soil. The morning air is noisy with the sounds of neighbors shouting across canals, canoes bumping into each other, and dogs barking from the edges of chinampas. You're starting to realize that floating gardens don't just grow food and flowers, they grow people too. And when people live close enough to toss a gourd across the water and hit someone's roof, things get interesting. Every chinampa family tends its own plots, but canals don't respect privacy the way walls do. You hear your neighbors as if they're sitting right beside you, a couple arguing over bean harvests, children squealing in play, a grandmother singing to the squash vines. Community here is loud, intimate, and sometimes a little too familiar. Historians still argue whether chinampa farming fostered more cooperation or more conflict. On one hand, families had to work together to dredge canals, manage water flow, and share access. On the other, boundaries blurred. A storm might shove your chinampa a few feet into your neighbor's territory, and suddenly you're in a heated dispute about stolen land, even if it floated there by accident. This closeness sparks rivalries. You witness two men paddling furiously, each accusing the other of letting ducks trample their maize. Voices rise, paddles splash, until an elder intervenes, reminding them the gods see everything. The men grumble, but back down, glaring across the water like rival pizza shops on the same block. Still, the tension is balanced by laughter. You watch neighbors barter squash for chilies, fish for maize flour. Someone cracks a joke about the way another's canoe leans as if it's drunk. The insult lands, the group bursts out laughing, and the air feels lighter. And here's a quirky tidbit. Chinampa communities sometimes held canoe races during festivals. Imagine a crowd cheering as farmers who spend most of their days slowly paddling suddenly whip their boats down narrow canals, crashing into each other and flipping into the water. It wasn't always graceful, but it was entertainment. By midday, the canals buzz like a living marketplace. Families shout across the water about trade marriages and who has the fattest turkeys this season. Children ferry notes between plots, giggling when they splash each other. A woman leans from her chinampa, handing you a tamale wrapped in steaming maize leaves. The generosity warms you, even as a different neighbor mutters about someone stealing their flowers last night. The closeness isn't just social, it's spiritual too. Small shrines sit on the edges of chinampas decorated with flowers and feathers. Families make offerings together, asking the gods for fertile soil and calm waters. It's community reinforced by ritual, like a sacred HOA meeting, but with more incense and fewer fines. As the sun sets, voices echo across the lake, softened by distance. Torches glow, casting reflections that flicker on the canals. Despite the rivalries, despite the arguments, there's comfort in the noise. You're never alone here. The lake carries every voice, binding neighbors together in ways as tangled and stubborn as the roots holding the chinampas in place. And as you drift to sleep, you wonder if this noisy network of families can build a community on water. What happens when an empire demands that same community feed its hunger? Dawn paints the lake in pale silver, and today you feel a shift in the air. The chinampas aren't just for feeding families anymore. They've become the pantry of an empire. You hear it in the distant beat of drums from Tenochtitlan, calling for tribute, and you see it in the endless canoes gliding past, piled high with food destined not for homes, but for the city's granaries. You kneel in the soil, pulling up squash heavy enough to make your back ache, and you know most of it won't stay here. Maize, beans, chilies, amaranth, all of it will be recorded, counted, and carried off as part of the tribute system that feeds priests, warriors, nobles, and the ever-expanding capital. Historians still argue whether the tribute system was more about economic necessity or political control. Was it really just about feeding the city's population, or was it a way for rulers to remind every farmer who held power over the harvest? Either way, the effect is the same. Your floating garden doesn't just belong to you anymore, it belongs to the empire. You paddle alongside others, your canoe stacked high with baskets. The canals grow crowded, a watery highway clogged with food shipments. Canoes scrape against each other, curses fly, and still the traffic flows toward the heart of Tenochtitlan. You feel small in the rush, a single drop feeding a river too vast to resist. And here's a quirky tidbit. Aztec tribute records didn't only list food, they also demanded frogs, insects, and even exotic flowers. Imagine your ruler saying, "Yes, we'll take 200 baskets of maize, 40 gourds of beans, and oh, don't forget those shiny beetles, thanks." Empire cuisine had range. By midday, you're in the city market, dizzy from the noise and smells. Pyramids loom above you, incense drifts thick in the air, and the marketplace churns with buyers and sellers. Your squash disappears into hands you never see again, your maize added to mountains of yellow grain. Somewhere scribes mark down numbers on bark paper codices, tribute flowing in like the tide. You overhear merchants boasting that the Chinampas can produce up to 7 harvests a year, thanks to the constant mud dredging and the rich soil. You shake your head in disbelief, but it's true, these floating plots are so productive that they practically burst with food, enough to feed hundreds of thousands, enough to fuel armies marching across Mesoamerica. As the sun sets, you paddle home, your canoe empty. The lake looks the same, still dotted with flowers and reeds, but you feel the weight of something larger pressing down. Your Chinampa feeds not just your family, not just your neighbors, but a capital city rising on an island of stone and ambition. You lie back in your canoe, exhausted, staring at the stars mirrored in the water. Tribute has turned your floating garden into part of a machine, a stomach that never stops demanding more. And as you drift towards sleep, one thought lingers. If the empire depends on these gardens, what happens when the gardens falter? The air is still cool when you push your canoe from the Chinampa edge, but dawn is already humming with activity. Across the water, farmers are doing the same, their canoes stacked with baskets of maize, chilies, beans, squash, and bundles of flowers so bright they glow in the dim light. The lake feels like a road at rush hour, except instead of honking horns, you hear the steady plunk-plunk of paddles slicing water. You join the current, drifting with dozens of others toward the beating heart of the empire. Mist curls low, turning canoes into ghostly shapes until the sun burns through. The chatter of neighbors drifts across the water, jokes about whose canoe leaks most, gossip about which noble was spotted in the market last week, and playful teasing about someone's chilies being too mild for even a child's tongue. The journey is long, but laughter oils the hours. Historians still argue whether market days were mostly practical, feeding people, or whether they doubled as grand social gatherings like weekly festivals. What's clear is that the canals were the veins, and these dawn convoys of canoes were the lifeblood that kept Tenochtitlan thriving. You paddle steadily, your muscles burning with the rhythm, until the city begins to rise from the lake. At first, it's just a smudge on the horizon, then a shimmer of stone and sunlight, and finally towers and temples standing impossibly tall from their island base. The sight is so dazzling that Spanish conquistadors, centuries later, would write about it with awe, comparing it to Venice. But you don't need comparisons, you're living it. The canals grow narrower as you approach the city crowded with traffic. Vendors call out from boats selling roasted maize cakes, sweetened amaranth, and cups of foamy chocolate drink. You grab one, savoring the bitterness, and spice, half smiling, as froth clings to your lip. Breakfast on the water, better than any modern drive-through. By the time you reach the main market, your senses are overwhelmed. Canoes unload their cargo, and the air fills with the mingled smells of fresh produce, roasted chilies, and incense from nearby temples. You hear the drone of drums, the trill of flutes, and the constant murmur of thousands of voices. The Tlatelolco market is so vast it seems like a city within a city, and your little basket of maize is just one grain in a mountain. And here's a quirky tidbit. The market had officials who acted like referees, making sure no one cheated, weighed falsely, or caused trouble. Think of them as ancient food inspectors crossed with referees in striped capes. You sell your goods, accept obsidian blades and cacao beans in trade, and wander the stalls. Bright feathers shimmer in the sun, traders hawk jade and turquoise, and bundles of flowers spill over tables. Somewhere a man shouts an offer for dried grasshoppers, crunchy snacks with just the right kick of chili. You take a handful, salty, spicy, surprisingly addictive. By dusk you're paddling home, the city glowing behind you, its temples catching the last fire of the sun. The water is calm, the stars begin to prick the sky, and your canoe rocks gently with each stroke. The journey to market is long, exhausting, and necessary. It ties your chinampa to the heart of the empire, each trip another thread in the vast web that holds it all together. And as you close your eyes, you can't help but wonder what happens when the weather shifts, when storms rise, when the gardens and canoes can no longer keep up with mouths that never stop multiplying. Dark clouds roll over the valley, heavy and swollen, and you know before the first raindrops fall that trouble is coming. The chinampas are sturdy, yes, but nature doesn't care how clever your engineering is. Tonight the lake is restless, and when the storm breaks, it thrashes like an angry god. Rain pelts your shoulders, soaking through your cloak. Lightning cracks above, illuminating a forest of chinampa poles swaying like spears. You scramble to secure your canoe, your feet slipping in the mud. Water sloshes over the edges of the gardens, threatening to wash away the seedlings you planted just days ago. Your heart races. This patch of soil is survival, and survival feels very fragile right now. Historians still argue whether flooding was more damaging than drought in the Valley of Mexico. The lake's shallow waters made it prone to both extremes: too much rain, and it swallowed the chinampas; too little, and the crops withered. Either way, the Aztecs fought a constant battle against water's moods. You wake the next morning to silence broken only by frogs croaking in puddles. The storm has passed, but the damage remains. Some chinampas are half drowned, their edges crumbling into the canal. Neighbors wade through knee-deep water, salvaging beans that washed loose, dragging canoes that drifted off in the night. The smell of rot already creeps in, a warning that the harvest may not be enough. And here's a quirky tidbit: during especially bad floods, some families tried to float their entire homes on reed rafts like makeshift houseboats. Picture your living room gently bobbing on a canal, your bed sloshing side to side every time someone rolls over. Cozy maybe. Seasick, definitely. When drought comes, it's another kind of misery. The soil cracks, canals shrink, and fish flop desperately in the mud. You paddle further and further to dredge up enough muck to feed the chinampas, your arms aching with the effort. Every kernel of maize, every bean pod becomes precious. The market prices soar, and rumors of famine ripple like wind across the water. By midday, you help neighbors replant what the storm destroyed. There's a grim camaraderie to it, everyone covered in mud, everyone muttering about the gods being fickle, everyone secretly afraid of what happens if the rains don't balance out again. Hunger is a constant shadow here, stalking even the most fertile fields. At sunset, you sit on the edge of a chinampa, watching the lake glow red under the fading sky. Your stomach rumbles, and you think of the empire's endless appetite. Tribute demands don't shrink just because storms have ruined crops. The city still expects its maize, its beans, its chilies. The gods still expect their offerings, and you're left wondering how long this fragile system can endure the push and pull of nature. You lie back in your canoe, rocking gently, eyes tracing the first stars. The chinampas rarely sink, but the fear of failure never quite leaves. You can build anchor and plant, but in the end, you're still at the mercy of water, wind, and sky. And as you drift into uneasy sleep, you wonder, when the empire's hunger grows larger than the lake can satisfy, who will be watching from the shadows, waiting for a chance to take it all. Morning fog drapes across the lake, curling low around the chinampas like ghostly blankets. You paddle slowly, listening to the splash of your paddle echo in the mist, but today feels different. It's not just the weather. It's the tension in the air, the whispers carried from canoe to canoe. War drums beating in the distance, warriors gathering on the mainland, nobles calling for more tribute than ever before. The Aztec Empire isn't just fed by chinampas, it's fueled by conquest. Every battle means more tribute, more mouths to feed in the capital, and more pressure on you and your neighbors to keep the floating gardens overflowing. You tug at your paddle muscles, straining, and think about how this patch of soil under your feet is linked to wars fought miles away. Historians still argue whether the empire's rapid expansion was sustainable. Some claim the Chinampa's productivity made conquest possible, while others suggest the endless need for tribute drove expansion too far too fast. Either way, you can feel the strain. The city calls for warriors, and young men from Chinampa families answer. You watch them march away, obsidian-tipped spears glinting in the sun, their sandals slapping the causeways. Their mothers stand silent on the banks, hiding tears. You know some won't return, and you also know their families will depend even more on their Chinampas to survive. And here's a quirky tidbit: before battles, warriors sometimes painted their faces with strange symbols and wore elaborate feathered costumes, making them look more like mythical creatures than soldiers. Imagine heading into combat looking like a brightly colored bird. It's intimidating, sure, but it also means you'd better win. No sneaking around in camouflage for these guys. Back on the water, life goes on. You dredge mud, tie willows, plant beans. But your ears are always straining for the distant sound of drums or conch shells, the signals of war and victory. The markets buzz with rumors of conquered towns, new foods arriving as tribute, new demands for the gardens to produce even more. By nightfall, you sit by the canal gazing at the stars reflected in the water. The Chinampas seem eternal, but you know they are bound tightly to the empire's rise. The stronger the empire grows, the more fragile you feel, caught in a system that depends on your floating patch of earth. As you close your eyes, the air feels heavy with questions. How long can these gardens hold up against hunger, war, and weather alike? And if they falter, does the empire crumble with them? The lake is calm tonight, but the city is anything but. Fires flicker from temple tops, casting long shadows across the water, and the air carries the low thrum of drums that never seem to stop. You paddle closer, heart tight in your chest, because you know what those drums mean. Somewhere inside the great temple complex, priests prepare for offerings meant to keep the sun rising and the rains falling. Historians still argue whether the Chinampa system was directly tied to the cycle of sacrifice, or whether the two simply overlapped in Aztec life. What's certain is this: every bean, every maize cob you harvest is in some way part of the offerings to the gods. The floating gardens don't just feed people, they feed rituals that keep the universe spinning. By dawn, you're at the market again. The place is louder than usual, the press of bodies thicker, the stalls brimming with tribute goods from across the empire. But underneath the chatter, there's tension, nervous laughter, sharp whispers. Traders complain that the canals are crowded, that the demand for maize is impossible, that drought has thinned harvests. Yet the city consumes without pause. And here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes farmers offered miniature Chinampas, tiny reed mats with little plants, as symbolic gifts to the gods, hoping it would encourage bigger harvests. Like the Aztec version of putting a model airplane on your desk and dreaming of travel. As you wander the stalls, you overhear debates: who has the right to water, who pays tribute in cacao, who dares to keep food back for their family instead of the market. Voices rise, fists clench, and market officials step in with sharp gestures. It's a reminder that this system only works if everyone keeps rowing in the same direction. By evening, you're back on your Chinampa watching the temple fires flare again. The empire seems unstoppable, a machine fueled by floating gardens and human lives alike. But deep down, you can't shake the feeling that something is shifting. The demand grows heavier, the balance more fragile. The lake glimmers dark under the stars reflecting the temples above, and you wonder how long this reflection can hold before it ripples, cracks, and finally breaks. You lean back, letting the canoe rock gently. The frogs croak, the willows whisper, but your mind keeps circling the same question. What happens when the floating gardens can no longer float under the weight of an empire's hunger? Dawn slips over the horizon, pale and uncertain, and you wake to the sound of shouts echoing across the water. Canoes rush past paddles, slicing furiously, voices sharp with urgency. You push away from your chinampa's edge, trying to make sense of it, and then you see the smoke-dark plumes rising near the causeways, smearing the morning sky. The Spaniards are here, and the siege has begun. Your canoe rocks under you as you drift closer, drawn by a mix of fear and disbelief. Across the water, you glimpse armored figures, metal, glinting horses, stamping weapons unlike any you've seen. They stand at the edge of the Empire's jewel, staring at the city that floats like a dream on the lake. And you know they want it all. Historians still argue whether the Spanish truly grasped the complexity of the Chinampa system at first sight. Some accounts suggest they thought the floating gardens were literal rafts, while others imply they recognized the genius of the engineering. What's certain is that they quickly understood their strategic value. Whoever controlled the Chinampas controlled the food, and without food, the great city would starve. You watch as neighbors scramble to dismantle their gardens, hauling poles and reeds to reinforce barricades. Maize stalks become shields, willow trunks become spears. The Chinampas that once fed the empire are torn up to defend it. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some defenders deliberately flooded sections of canal, hoping to trap Spanish horses that weren't exactly designed for wading through waist-deep muck. Imagine the proud conquistador suddenly realizing his magnificent steed is basically stuck in a swamp. Not the heroic image he had in mind, but the siege tightens day by day. Canoes that once carried vegetables now carry warriors. The water is choked with debris, broken rafts, and shattered canoes. Nights echo with the clash of obsidian blades against steel, with cries that carry across the lake. You trudge along the muddy edges of a Chinampa, exhausted, stomach hollow. Food grows scarce. The once rich fields now lie abandoned or destroyed. The smell of smoke and rot hangs heavy. You try to dredge mud to plant again, but arrows whistle overhead, and you dive for cover. Survival has shifted from feeding the empire to simply living another day. By the time the sun sets, the water glows red with firelight, and the city trembles. The floating gardens, once a miracle of resilience, buckle under war. You lean against a willow trunk, heart hammering, and whisper the question. Everyone else is too afraid to voice, is this the end of the empire that the Chinampas built? The smoke never clears. Days bleed into nights, and nights into more days of hunger, fire, and silence, broken only by distant screams. You move along the edge of your Chinampa, but it hardly feels like a garden anymore. The once green rows are trampled flat, the soil cracked and dry, where water no longer flows freely. Canoes lie splintered on the banks, their paddles lost in the mud. The siege has drained the lake of its purpose. Where once it carried food, flowers, and laughter, now it carries wreckage and ash. You watch bloated fish float belly up, poisoned by the blood and debris washing into the water. The Chinampas that had fed generations cannot withstand this storm. Historians still argue whether famine or disease dealt the harsher blow during these final days of Tenochtitlan. Some say hunger broke the will of the defenders, others claim it was smallpox sweeping through the city. You feel both forces pressing in your belly, gnaws at itself, and coughing fits echo from every canal-side hut. Yet in the midst of ruin you notice fragments of persistence. A woman stoops to pull amaranth from a surviving patch of soil, cradling the tiny leaves as if they were jewels. A child scoops water into clay jars, straining it through reeds in hopes of one clean sip. Even here where destruction reigns, the instinct to survive clings stubbornly. And here's a quirky tidbit. During the chaos, some Spaniards reportedly marveled at how the Chinampas still produced crops even as the city burned. Imagine being an invader, armored and weary, and stumbling across neat rows of maize still growing in a lake of fire and smoke. It must have felt almost supernatural. But for you, the wonder is gone. You lie on your back in the canoe, ribs sharp against your skin, staring at the stars through the haze. The night sky seems close enough to touch, yet unbearably distant. The Chinampas, once so alive, now feel like tombstones floating on dark water. The drums are silent now, replaced by the hollow cries of defeat. You know the city is falling. You know the empire built on these floating gardens is breaking apart. And as the night deepens, you can't help but ask yourself, when the dust settles, will the Chinampas die too? Or will they somehow outlive the empire they sustained? The fires are out now. The city lies in ruins. Its once glistening temples toppled, its canals clogged with rubble, and the echoes of conquest fading into a heavy silence. You stand at the edge of your Chinampa, bare feet sinking into damp soil, and the world feels impossibly changed. The empire that demanded so much from these floating gardens is gone. Yet when you kneel and press your hands into the earth, the mud still smells rich. The willows still drink from the water. And somewhere under the soil, maize seeds wait. The Chinampas are scarred, yes, but they are not dead. The Spaniards take control, surveying the strange gardens with a mixture of awe and confusion. Some try to adapt them for their own use, others neglect them, believing European-style fields will do better. Historians still argue whether colonial neglect or urban expansion caused the greatest damage to the Chinampas. What's certain is that many survived quietly, stubbornly feeding not empires but families. Here's a quirky tidbit: centuries later, farmers in Xochimilco still ride canoes out to tend Chinampas, sometimes using the same tools their ancestors did. Tourists glide past in painted boats, sipping drinks, listening to mariachi bands, never realizing they're floating through one of the oldest continuous farming systems in the world. You paddle along, imagining those futures centuries ahead, where your garden still breathes long after empires fall. You touch the willow trunks, older now, thicker roots gripping deeper than ever. The Chinampas may not belong to kings anymore, but they still belong to the water, to the soil, to the people who care for them. And as you drift under the fading stars, you realize the empire was fleeting, but the gardens endure. Floating, silent, patient. Outlasting conquest, outlasting collapse, waiting for the next dawn. The water is calm now, a mirror stretched beneath the softest sky. Your canoe rocks gently, carrying you not toward battles or markets, but toward rest. The sounds of the city fade into nothing, leaving only the lapping of water and the distant murmur of frogs. You let your eyes close halfway, watching ripples blur into silvery lines, feeling the cool air brush your skin. The Chinampas, those floating fields of soil and willow, are no longer heavy with demands or fear. They are just what they have always been: quiet, fertile, timeless. You imagine seeds settling into the earth, roots stretching slowly, confidently, weaving themselves into the lakebed. Above, willows sigh in the breeze, and maize leaves rustle like whispers. Every sound is slower now, every movement softened, as though the entire world is rocking you gently to sleep. The empire, the wars, the endless hunger of rulers, all of that drifts away. What remains is water, soil, and the patient rhythm of growth. These gardens have floated through centuries, and they'll float through this night too, carrying you into dreams as steady as the lake itself. So let your breath slow. Let your body sink into stillness like roots sinking into soil. And let the floating gardens hold you gently until sleep takes you where no hunger, no fire, no fear can reach. Sweet dreams.